Hello and welcome to this lecture video. This video is a continuation of the Linux concept videos that I started in the previous video. Again, as I introduced in the previous video, my name is Kyle Church. I'm an instructor at Ball State University for a variety of computer information technology courses, and I teach an introductory and advanced Linux course, and ultimately I'm creating these videos not only to help those students, but also to help anyone else who's interested in learning more about Linux. So in the first video, I introduced basic concepts such as explaining what the command line interface is, explaining what a shell is. I'm explaining that Bash is the default shell for most Linux distributions. And we also discussed the various tricks that you can utilize with the Bash shell. For example, utilizing the history command, as well as the history file, being able to recall commands that you previously type in, being able to use tab to autocomplete commands, or to search a list of various commands that start with a certain set of letters or values. And we also explained what ultimately the command structure is, and showed it or introduced the concept of the list or ls command. In this video, I'm going to discuss in terms of concepts, internal and external commands, and I'm also going to introduce the concept of special characters and file paths. So internal commands in a Linux system are those commands that are built into the shell. In other words, rather than ultimately you having the shell itself or Bash search a given file path for a command, the command is simply just built into the shell. And it's faster this way because ultimately, again, if it's an external command, it's going to have some file path associated with it. And it's typically going to have to utilize that path variable based off of that particular file path. And ultimately, the Bash shell is going to search that file path or that path variable to see where that particular process or command is located. And additionally, you may have to spawn additional processes to execute it. Internal commands don't have to go through that process, therefore they're faster. Some internal commands include source and cd. And ultimately, if you're wanting to know whether a command is internal or external, which I'll explain external commands in just a second, we can use the type command to tell us whether it's internal or external. If it's internal, the shell will display output saying that it is a shell built-in. If it's external, it'll either include a file path or it'll mention that the command's an alias of a particular file path. Anything that includes a file path is going to be an external command. And external commands are simply commands that are not built into the shell. When an external command has to be executed, the shell looks for its path given in the path variable, and also a new process has to be spawned. And ultimately, once that new process is spawned, the command will be executed. These are the commands that are typically located in the /bin or /user/bin directories. For example, when you execute the cat command, which usually is at /user/bin, the executable /user/bin/cat ultimately gets executed. Now, cat stands for concatenate. It's a command I'll explain in greater details in the next videos or next upcoming videos. But ultimately, it's an important command you can use to read files and add text to files. Now, ultimately, this is an example where you enter in the shell or Bash terminal. You type the command type and echo, and ultimately tells us that the echo command is a shell built-in, telling us that echo is in fact an internal command. Now, as I mentioned in the previous video, I mentioned the ls command, and I also only made the mistake of saying that ls is an internal command, and ls is actually an external command, and I'll explain why that is in just a second. But ultimately, as mentioned in the previous video, ls lists the contents of a directory, and that's only the command itself without any command options listed. However, as I mentioned in the previous video, it doesn't show any hidden files. So if you want to see hidden files, ultimately you're going to have to use a command option, which is -a. ls-a will display all the contents of the directory, including the hidden files and hidden directories. And ultimately, if I issue the command type in ls, I get a output display to the terminal that mentions that ls is aliased to a particular location. It's ultimately aliased to ls-color equals auto. Ultimately, this is an external command because, again, as I mentioned, external commands are either going to have a file path associated with them, or they're going to include some type of alias. We also have the change directory command, and we mentioned an ultimately change directory. The shorthand for that, or the actual command you type in the terminal, is cd. But the cd command is an internal bash command. And ultimately, if I type and cd, it'll ultimately tell me that cd is a shell built-in. But basically, cd allows us to navigate through different directories on a Linux distro. Again, distro in terms of distribution, like Debian, Ubuntu, Linux Mint. And it requires the cd command and ultimately a file path as an argument. So what is a file path? Well, the file path is the series of folders traversed to get to some particular resource. It could be a command. It could be to actually navigate to a particular directory to be able to list the contents of that directory. It might need to be utilized to call certain files, or such as read certain files in certain directories. Ultimately, a file path is going to be used in most cases when you're changing directories. Now, ultimately, what you're going to understand with the Linux system is that Linux file structure starts from a single /. Ultimately, that / is going to be called root. So basically, when you see a /, that is referring to the root part of the file system, or the root file system itself. This is similar to how Windows starts at C. C would be kind of the C directory or folder would be kind of similar to that of the root folder or root directory on a Linux system. So why is this important? Ultimately, command line interfaces don't have back buttons. You're not just going to be able to go back, like for example, when you're using a file explorer in Windows. When you use a file explorer in Windows, you have options to navigate backwards and forwards using a GUI. Ultimately, in command line, you don't have that. So you need to know how to change from one directory to another. And ultimately, you're going to navigate these through the use of these file paths. Now, when we're talking about file paths, typically we refer to them in one of two ways. We refer to them as an absolute file path, which means it starts from root, or a relative file path, which simply means it starts relative to the current folder we're working in. So again, we have a /, which is root. Again, if it's an absolute file path, it will always start at root. If it's a relative file path, it will not start at root. You'll, for example, type in cd and then desktop. If you're already in your user's own directory, you might type cd /. Then basically that's telling you that's the actual directory you're in currently. So /, and then type desktop. Either one of those is utilizing a relative path, because relative paths are going to start either with a period, it could start with a sequence of periods, or it's going to start with an actual, simply just a subdirectory like cd desktop. Again, and if you're going to use a relative file path and you're not in that directory currently, your best bet is to utilize a combination of periods and /s ultimately, because those /s are not only going to signify root, but in some cases, for example, if you type cd, you put 2 periods. Let's say you're in the desktop subdirectory of your user's home directory. If you type in cd /, it'll take you back in one directory. And that's ultimately what that / after the 2 periods is representing. Again, we're going to discuss more and show details of this a little bit later on in this video, as well as when I discuss directories and creating directories and creating files and removing files in a later video. So part of it later is now. Ultimately, I do want to mention that the CLI will start, and typically in most cases, again, as I mentioned, it will have the prompt. The prompt is typically signified by a $, and after that $, is typically where you type the command. As mentioned, you have your username at typically the name of the machine, but you typically see a tilde, and this is where you typically start when you open up a terminal. Well, the item in red is the current folder you're in. In this case, we're in the tilde. Now, if this doesn't make a lot of sense, let's elaborate a little bit on this. This example, or the tilde, is a reference to the user's home directory. In this case, the user Kyle's home folder or home directory /home/Kyle. So if you see a tilde, it's referring, and you're signed in, for example, as user Kyle. That means you know it's going to be the actual absolute path is going to be /home/Kyle. Why is it the absolute path? Because again, it starts at root. Now, ultimately, if the user is Ben, it'll be /home/Ben, or if it's Jill, it'll be /home/Jill. Ultimately, it's that tilde is going to be in reference to the user, and ultimately the user being the user you're logged in as, home directory. So what does this file path show us? Well, ultimately, this shows us that we're in the documents subdirectory of the user, my user's home directory, which again is /home/Kyle. So back to the path. When a user wants to move folders, they'll have to tell the CLI where to move, ultimately. This is why when I talked about the CD command, which is again, it stands for change directory, you have to include a file path as an argument. If the current location is /documents, again, this would be /home/Kyle/documents. Is this an absolute or relative path? Ultimately, it is an absolute path. Now, what would it be the relative path? If I'm already in this user's directory, well, it would simply be a period / and documents. If you are familiar with any computer programming, for example, if you utilized ultimately you're calling files on a system, and let's say, for example, it could be an HTML file or a JavaScript file, and ultimately you're wanting to source a particular image or some particular thing for that particular web page, and you want to include a particular folder where that ultimate information is stored. And if you include the absolute file path, it's going to always tie it to that machine. And as long as the user is on that machine, it will direct it back to that image or aspect that you want to show that's stored again within a folder. But if you use a relative file path, that means any particular person on their system could ultimately see that information, because ultimately it's not having to be tied to that system, to that person's system. So relative paths, absolute paths are applied in a lot more areas than just simply Linux. But ultimately, when you are referring to a relative path for that particular example, or if ultimately you're just wanting to refer to the current directory you're in by utilizing a /, well, you would ultimately want it to include a period, because the period is going to tell you this is basically going to be, that's the directory I'm in. I do the /, and I do documents, which ultimately will take me to the subdirectory of the directory I'm currently in, which in this case would be my user's home directory. So relative paths maybe are ultimately confusing at first, but once you use them, it's going to be a little bit easier to distinguish what they are. But ultimately, the easiest way to distinguish between a relative and an absolute path is asking yourself the question, does the path start with a /? Why is that? Well, if it is, it's an absolute path because it starts at root. So why do many students have issues with this? Well, people tend to forget that an absolute path has to be from the start of the folder structure. Again, what is the start of the folder structure? It is root. So ultimately, will this take some practice? Yes, but you want to understand that it's very useful to understand that absolute paths start at root. Relative paths start with whatever directory you're currently in. So for example, if I want to use the CD command, again, CD stands for change directory, allows the users to navigate the Linux files and directories. When it comes to CD, there's so many options in terms of getting back to the user's home directory. Some of the shortcuts include simply just typing CD. CD, if you're in any other directory, will automatically take you back to your user's home directory. You can type CD and then the variable home. That variable home also refers to the user's home directory. You could type, let's say you're in a subdirectory, you could type CD .. That would take you back to the user's home directory. If you're within the subdirectory of the user's home directory, you could also type CD and the tilde character, which again, the tilde character is an absolute path. It refers back simply to /home/ that user's home directory, which ultimately, for example, in my case would be /home/Kyle. So ultimately, I'm going to show you the use of the CD command in the Linux terminal. So first of all, as I mentioned, you can use the type command to ultimately determine whether a command is internal or external. As I mentioned before, the CD command is an internal bash command, and it's telling me this simply because when I type the command type in CD, it tells me that it is a shell built-in. Whereas if I mentioned before, ls is not a shell built-in, it is actually an external command. Now, In terms of what directory we're currently working in, if you notice, as I mentioned before, we have our prompt here at where we actually type our actual text-based commands after the $sign. But at the beginning, we have the username at the particular name of the machine. And then after the colon, we see a tilde. This tilde is telling us that we are currently in my user's home directory. I can actually also know what directory I'm in by simply typing the command pwd. pwd stands for print working directory, and it will ultimately print to the terminal what directory I'm in. So I can also verify that I'm in fact in the directory /home/Kyle. But as you'll notice, whenever you log into the terminal or start logging into the machine and open up the terminal, you'll notice that you're always starting at your user's home directory. And then ultimately, if you're in a subdirectory, it'll have a tilde and then a / telling you where you're at. But pwd again will show you the absolute file path. So in all reality, either one of them is going to tell you effectively what particular directory you're in. So we'll see what subdirectories are available in my user's home directory. Again, the ls command is the perfect command to tell me what contents ultimately what the contents are of this particular directory. And it's going to tell me basically right now, since I have no files in it, it's going to be all directories. All of these are different subdirectories that I can navigate to through the use of the cd command. So I can type cd, I can do a relative path, and I can simply type cd and desktop. And when I'm utilizing a desktop in this particular format, I am utilizing it as a relative path because I'm already in my user's home directory. Now I'm navigating to a subdirectory that's within it. So in this case, desktop. Again, I can navigate back home by simply typing cd. And you've noticed I moved from my user's home directory. Once I typed cd and desktop, once I moved from just my user's home directory to the desktop directory, which is a part within my user's home directory, which again, I have the tilde and then I have the /. The / in this case does not signify root. What it signifies is it's basically a next level or ultimately a directory. So it's used, if it starts with a /, that means it starts at root. If it has a / further, once you have a very long file path name, like if I type pwd, you notice I have a / home. This is talking about root. This is talking about the home folder within root. This is talking about the Kyle folder within the home folder, which is stored within the root folder. So at the beginning of it, the file path is simply referring to the actual root of the file system. But every subsequent / is just referring to a different directory within the previous directory. So I mentioned that I can navigate to the desktop with the relative path of just simply desktop since I'm in my user's home directory. I can also type it as a period / and desktop. This will also navigate me to the desktop subdirectory using a relative path. Again, I can type cd to get back to my user's home directory, or I can simply type in cd period. If I type cd period, this will not always take me back to my user's home directory. What it will do though is it will take me back one directory level above where I currently am. So if I'm in desktop, one directory level above desktop would be /Kyle. And again, I'll navigate back to desktop to show you. If I type the pwd command, which again stands for print working directory, you'll notice that desktop is a subdirectory within the Kyle directory, which is ultimately a subdirectory within the home directory, which ultimately is a subdirectory within root. Again, everything starts at root. Now, by typing that period, what that is doing is it's moving me out of desktop and into Kyle. I can also type in cd, and then I can type $home. This will also bring me back to my user's home directory. And then let's say I want to move to documents instead of desktop, and I want to use the full file path. Well, the full file path, I already know that I'm at home /Kyle. Again, I'm using tab to do the auto completion. Now, what I can do is I can then type the next directory I want to navigate to. By using ls above, I know what the other subdirectories are besides desktop. In this case, for example, I can do documents. And once I hit enter, I am now in the documents subdirectory. And basically, What I'm telling you is that you can use an absolute file path or a relative file path to navigate the Linux system. Again, the absolute file path is going to start with a / at the beginning, which signifies root. Whereas if you're doing a relative path, for example, if you go back up here where I typed in cd desktop up here, since I'm already in the Kyle subdirectory, that again is a subdirectory of home, again, my user's home directory, I type cd desktop, since I'm already in a directory of my user's home directory, by just typing desktop, I'm using a relative path. Or if I type a period and a / and then desktop, again, an absolute or relative path, excuse me. But when I typed it here, I was using an absolute path. Now, as I mentioned before, I can use the tilde also to navigate back to my user's home directory. And in this case, what the tilde is the tilde is actually an absolute file path because it ultimately means /home/Kyle. So again, I can use absolute file paths or relative file paths to navigate the Linux directory. Now I'm going to bring up a Word document that includes a homework assignment that I typically give to my Linux introductory course, which is CT 221. And I'm going to first go to this exercise here, exercise 2. Again, if you ever just have any type of questions on an exam where it's asking about asking you to differentiate between an absolute path and a relative path, again, it all depends on whether it starts at root. How do I know if it starts at root? It starts with a /. So this, for example, would be an absolute file path. Right. So this is an absolute file path. This starts with 2 periods. Essentially, if I would type cd, and let's say I'm in the downloads, a subdirectory within downloads, I type cd and I type base / downloads. Basically, it's going to take me back to the downloads subdirectory instead. This would be using a relative path because it does not start with a /. Now, this particular question is a little interesting. It doesn't start with periods, nor does it start with a /. It starts with a tilde. Remember, the tilde is a reference, a reference to the absolute file path /home, and whatever user's home directory it is, depending upon what user you're logged in as. Again, I'm logged in as Kyle, so mine's going to be /home/Kyle. So ultimately, the tilde is a absolute file path reference to /home/Kyle. So this would be an absolute file path. Again, it's going to take some practice ultimately understanding the differences. But as I said before, if it ever starts with root, well, ultimately that is referring to an absolute path. So if I just type cd and root, that's an absolute file path. Unless I can see all kinds of different directories that are within the root directory, including the binary files I mentioned previously, as well as the home directory. So let's say I navigate to home. When I type it this way, again, I am now using a relative file path. I'm within the root directory. Home is a subdirectory within root. So if I just type it as home, I'm using it in a relative file path. If I do cd / and then home, I'm using an absolute file path. Now I'm in home. I can see the different users' home directories. Of course, the only user on the system is Kyle. Again, I can navigate using a absolute file path or relative. If it's an absolute, again, it's going to start with root, and it's going to include the full file path. And if I want to use a relative file path, it's either going to start just simply with, like for example, Kyle, because again, I'm already within the home directory. And since Kyle is a subdirectory within home, I can just type Kyle instead. Or I can do period / Kyle. Both of these would be using a relative file path. And again, as I mentioned, print working directory or PWD is a useful command to determine what directory you're in, but you can also tell by the value that is before the $, which again is going to be in blue in this case. All right, now I'm going to just explain special characters. So how many special characters are there? Well, there are tons of special characters. I'm not going to even be able to go over them all in this video, but I'm going to go over the ones that I believe are most useful for you to know at this current moment. They can, ultimately what a special character means is that it means the shell should perform some type of action based on that particular special character. Now, one thing you want to keep in mind is that when you use them, ultimately using them in files and folder names is going to be causing you a lot of headaches. In fact, they're going to recommend you don't use them in file names because ultimately, if you use them in file names, you have to find some type of way to escape the special character. Now, keep in mind, special characters aren't going to be just different symbols like a tilde or a $sign. They can also be simply just white space. White space is basically the space between a command and like a command argument or a command option. And basically what the white space does is Bash uses that to determine where words begin and end. Ultimately, where does the command end and where does the option or argument begin? So I'm going to quickly go through a comprehensive list of different shell short shell special characters. Again, keep in mind this is not going to be all the special characters you can utilize on a Bash shell, but I'm going to be at least some that I believe are the most important for you to know. Again, we have the tilde. The tilde itself is a special character. It is a shorthand for the current user's home directory. You have a backslash. This backslash ultimately tells you to ignore the next character. What that means, it's going to ignore any special characters ultimately, which means if I'm going to use, for example, I have a file name that includes a special character like a white space. Well, I can use a backslash to escape that special character to call it in a Linux-based command. I'll show that to you here in a little bit. We also have a forward slash. This is either going to signify root or it's going to be used as a directory separator. We have the $, which is it for ultimately a variable, and typically it's going to precede any variable. If you remember when we used echo and then space the $, and the 0 value, that's a variable. Again, that's going to tell us what the default shell is on the Linux terminal. We also have our our question mark, which is a single character wildcard. We have a single absolute quotation mark. We have a backtick, which is typically used for command substitution. We have double quotation marks. Again, typically single or double quotation marks can be used to call particular file names or commands that also have special characters in them without having to use an escape character. We have a asterisk or a glob character. This is a wildcard. You can match pretty much anything to it. They typically call it the greedy match. But for example, if you typed like a asterisk and then .txt, let's say you're doing like some type of command to find all the text files in a directory. Well, if you did the glob character .txt, it will list every single text file. You have an ampersand or and symbol. This is a background. Typically, this is to allow you to put certain commands in the background or bring out to the foreground. You also have double ampersand, which basically is if one command is successful, then a second command is executed. Of course, typically if it has an exit status of 0, that means the command is successful. If it has an exit status of 1 or 127, it means the command was not successful in some way. Typically includes an error message. You also have a pipe character. This is to take basically a special character that takes output from one command and uses it as input for another. We also have double pipe, which basically is the opposite of the double ampersand. Basically, if the first command you type fails, then the second command is executed. You also have a semicolon, which is used to execute multiple commands in ultimately in a row, regardless of the exit status of the previous command. You still have some errors doing it this way, of course. You have brackets, which can be used to signify a range of numbers or letters. You have a forward or a greater than symbol, which is a redirection special character, which is used to redirect output. They refer to as standard output, a concept we're going to discuss in the next video. but ultimately we can use it to redirect. If it's just one symbol, it's redirection in terms of overwriting. If it's two greater than symbols, it's redirection in terms of appending, which appending simply overwriting means you're going to overwrite a file, which means all the contents of that file will be erased and the new contents will be all in that file. Whereas an append is adding text to the end of a file. You're not deleting the contents of the file, you're simply just adding to it. You also have a less than symbol, which is used to redirect input into a command. And you also are going to have, as we discussed, you'll have a number 2 and a greater than symbol. That's used to redirect what's referred to as standard error, a concept, again, we'll discuss in the next video. So ultimately, we know these exist. Now what? Well, we can use them in a wide array of different ways. But for now, what we want to understand is that if you're going to use it in a file path, which again is not recommended, you probably should not do so. But if you do, or if you're trying to call a special character without it actually executing the special character in the terminal, you would want to ultimately know how to escape it. How do you escape it? You use a backwards slash. So let's look at a file name, Linux homework and stuff with an exclamation point. How many of us ultimately see 3 special characters? Well, if we looked at simply the spaces, we would be right. That would be 3 special characters. But ultimately, you want to understand is that spaces are not the only special characters in this file name. Who says we have 4? Well, you could see you could include the spaces and the ampersand. The ampersand is also, again, a special character. Ultimately, what does that special character do? Well, again, it puts jobs in the background. Who says there's 5? Well, of course, we've mentioned already the 3 spaces, the ampersand, and also the exclamation point. Ultimately, there are 5 special characters. And if I wanted to actually call this particular file path in a Linux-based command, I would ultimately have to use a backward slash. So let's see what happens if I try to call it in terminal. Well, it would ultimately look something similar to this. It would be Linux \space homework \space ampersand \space stuff exclamation point. This would be every special character properly escaped. Now, if I compare it with a command, well, then ultimately I would issue something a command, for example, like ls space -l space Linux \space homework space ampersand space stuff exclamation point. Now the ls-l command, it's another -l is another option of ls. In this case, what it does is it lists the permissions of a file or directory. But ultimately, what I'm trying to show you here is that you want to make sure that if you're trying to call something in the terminal and you're trying to ensure that it does not use a special character, you want to make sure you use backward slashes. And ultimately, those backward slash or the backslash is going to be done to escape a special character. A lot of times, and why I just said that again, ultimately, is a lot of times what happens is someone will put an escape character and then they'll remove the space as well. Well, if the space was removed, what's the need of the special character? Or the escape character. So ultimately, if you're going to include the escape character, you want to still make sure you include the special character after it, including the space. All right, and there is a list of my sources for this video. Now, I'm going to open up the terminal again before I conclude the video, because I want to ultimately discuss the use of these various special characters, most importantly, the use of escaping a special character by using a backward slash. Before I actually use the terminal, though, I'm going to go to one of the Word documents I have again. This, again, is a homework assignment you would see in my introductory Linux course. And I'm going to walk through an example of escaping a special character in a file name. I'm going to start with the most difficult one. Now, keep in mind, if backward slashes are in a file name, I also have to escape backward slashes because backward slashes are special characters. So if I wanted to escape this properly, what I would do is I would do backward slash, and then I would need another backward slash to escape the space between the first backward slash and the file name. And I would type file name. I would type backward slash to escape the space. And I'll type with, and then a backward slash to escape the next space. And I'll type backslashes. Of course, I'll use a backslash to escape the space between that word and the next backslash. Again, I need another backslash here to escape the backslash and the file name, and that would be the proper way to escape the special characters in this particular instance. Now, you'll notice in this one, this is a hyphen here. Hyphens are not necessarily considered special characters. Even if you use an escape character in front of a hyphen, it doesn't necessarily really do anything. Now, in this case, this is a special character. So, for example, if I wanted to do this one, and this is the only other example I'm going to show, I would ultimately write it like this. I would type Linux backslash to escape the space between Linux and the greater than symbol. I would use a backslash to escape the greater than symbol. I would use another backslash after the greater than symbol because there's a space between that and Windows. And then I would ultimately type Windows. So that's an example of what I would do to escape the special characters in a file name. Now let's do this in the actual Linux terminal. Let's say I use a command to create an empty file. That command is in Linux is ultimately the touch command. I'm going to discuss in greater detail later on in the semester, or and ultimately if you're not in the class, later on in future videos. So I type the touch command, and let's say I type that same file path that is listed here. Wrong Word document, my apologies. I'm listed here. Well, I could copy this, and hopefully it'll allow me to paste it into here. There are times where you can't really paste between virtual machines and Word documents without setting up certain parameters of virtual or VMware. Don't have those set up, so I'm simply just going to type it. So I'm going to do half screen here real quick. And I'm going to type touch. Then I'm simply going to type // space file name / space with // / to escape the space, and then again another / to escape the /. When I hit enter, it's not going to display any output. If it doesn't display anything to the terminal, that typically means in terms of the touch command that the command is successful. I'm going to issue ls to verify that that file was actually created. And notice it is actually created. It includes this file name as it's displayed here. So ultimately, again, I can use escape characters to escape special characters. Special characters ultimately do something depending on the special character utilized. And that's ultimately what we're going to discuss for this video. Thank you for taking the time to listen. If you have any questions, again, I will post my email address in the comments or aspects of the video, details of the video. Thank you. And ultimately, if you have wish to leave any comments, I'll do my best to respond to those as well. Thank you again for taking time to watch this video, and have a nice day.